Well, on a much lighter note, it has been 3 days since the so-called fight of the century, but many boxing fans still can't get over their disappointment in Floyd Mayweather's lackluster win over Manny Pacquiao. But the fallout could be quite serious. We now know that Pacquiao had a shoulder injury before the fight. His team apparently lied on a medical questionnaire and under penalty of perjury. He now faces possible disciplinary action and lawsuits. And I probably face disciplinary actions for not saying much of that well. Joining me in the studio is sports journalist Didier Morais. Welcome back. It's good to see you.
Good to see you.
Usually have you on Reporters Rewind. You don't have to share the table with a bunch of other folks. Let's talk about this fight. You watched the fight on pay-per-view. Let's just talk about what your experience was. Did you have any inkling in the way Pacquiao fought that there was something wrong with his shoulder?
Absolutely not. Having seen many Floyd Mayweather and Manny Pacquiao fights, you know off the bat that Floyd Mayweather, he's a defensive fighter. So he's going to be the type to evade you, to dodge you, and he'll go poke a few punches, and that's usually how he gets those W's. Manny Pacquiao, now he's obviously more aggressive. He's very assertive. So that did catch me off guard that I didn't see him as assertive and as aggressive with his punches. And at the end of the day, I still attribute most of that to Mayweather because at the end of the day, a strong defense is going to overcome offense. So for me, the injury actually played into Mayweather's favor and into his hands.
Yeah, clearly it did. I have to say, when I first heard the news that Pacquiao revealed that he had a shoulder injury, I thought it was like sour grapes. I was like, oh man, he's just trying to excuse away why he lost. Turns out this is much more serious than anybody believed. Sort of walk people through what happened to his shoulder and how did it come to this?
Agreed. I was similarly like you. I was kind of skeptical at first, but in a way, I heard it's been described similarly to the shoulder injury that Kobe Bryant, the Lakers guard, suffered. But essentially, it's a significant tear in his shoulder. It seems to be a torn labrum, but it's one of those accidents that happens while you're sparring. And it seemed that he actually suffered the injury early in the sparring and the training process, but his trainer, Freddie Roach, said that as the weeks went on, he looked at least a little more stabilized, that he was able to go through with the fight. But they said they were considering postponing the fight. Ultimately, they didn't.
Well, and it took a long time to put this fight together, so I'm sure there was a lot at risk. But why wouldn't he, or why didn't he disclose this? Because that questionnaire is pretty darn specific.
Absolutely. I mean, the reality is that it took 6 years to make this fight, and there's so many back and forth. There's Floyd's camp blaming Manny Pacquiao. Manny's camp is blaming Floyd for the inability to put this together. And there were so many sticklers, whether it was drug testing, whether it was amount of money, Showtime, HBO. So with all those factors in play, the reality is if you're going to postpone it right before the match, you're going to have to reignite those discussions, and that's just opening up a whole other can of worms that, frankly, I personally think that if they did end up postponing that match, I think it actually wouldn't have come to fruition.
You think it wouldn't have happened at all?
Because there's so many things that can happen in a year. If Floyd loses, whoever the replacement is, then there's not as much pizzazz with that fight, or if somebody else gets injured, it's kind of difficult to market and get all those millions that they made.
Right, and let's face it, they're not getting any younger to boot in that regard. How much trouble could he get in not disclosing this, particularly in this medical questionnaire?
Realistically, it looks like Manny's going to face probably a suspension or a fine. I think he's probably going to end up getting a fine because he's still a premier boxer. Even at his age, he still brings a lot of money. And we already saw with Floyd Mayweather, especially with those domestic abuse allegations and with the conviction, he never got suspended for that. And one of the biggest reasons was that because Floyd Mayweather helped bring so much revenue to Las Vegas, they allowed him, even when he was sentenced to jail, they allowed him to go and report after one of his fights. So I kind of think the same wiggle room will apply to Manny. It's unfortunate, it's unfair world, but I think that's actually what's going to happen, and probably just get a slap on the wrist and move forward.
There are some of those out there who say that they do believe that someone leaked to the Mayweather team that Pacquiao had this injury and therefore capitalized on it. So I want to go back to what your observations from watching the game or watching the match was. Did you see Mayweather perform any differently than you've seen him before, maybe taking advantage of this information?
Not at all. Again, he's a defensive fighter, so he evades. Everybody was really angry with the fact that he runs, but that's how he is. That's how he was against Marcos Maidana. I mean, that's how he's been in the past against Sugar Shane Mosley and all of those other competitors. So again, Pacquiao's injury played into that. There's nothing really to take advantage per se. It just allows him. And again, at the end of the day, we wouldn't be talking about this if Manny won. I mean, it's the thing in sports that all athletes, they play injured. Now, some of them, if Manny had won, we'd be talking about Manny Pacquiao as a hero.
Right,
you know,
right.
He's a champion. He's a
through it,
you know,
literally.
and even like with the NBA, Chris Paul, the Clippers point guard, he played with an injured hamstring, and he helped the Clippers beat the Spurs. So he's considered a hero. Had they lost, we'd be questioning him and his coach. So again, that same theory applies to boxing. That, I mean, all athletes fight. Mayweather, I've seen his fights where he's fought with broken knuckles and broken hands. So it's sports. That's what happens.
And does this then obliterate the chance of a rematch? Because we were talking about a rematch before this fight even happened. Now that he's got to take a year at least to recover, can we expect a rematch, or you think ship has sailed?
At first, I thought the ship had sailed, but obviously Stephen A. Smith today reported that Floyd Mayweather actually left the door open, saying that he would be open to a rematch with Manny in a year. So potentially, I thought Mayweather was going to retire end of this year, but he could be going for that 50-0.
Well, time will tell, and we're all talking about it, and that's what they wanted.
Absolutely.
All right, Didier Morais, good to see you.
Good to see you.
Thank you.